All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're still on Nuclear Rivalry in the Cold War, 1950 to 1957, page 1015. Link to the PDF in the description if you want to read it yourself. Returned to Moscow from Geneva, Khrushchev abandoned his unwanted quiet and resumed his stalking of Molotov. In September 1955, the harassed foreign minister had to make a public confession of error, admitting that he did not know what point the Soviet Union had reached in its progress along the road to socialism. In February, he told the Supreme Soviet that the foundations of the socialist society had been built. It now appeared that the society itself was built. Such a mistake, regarded as picayune in the outside world, could inflict almost irreparable damage on a Soviet leader if publicly confessed, as this was. It was a clear indication to other such leaders that Molotov was on his way out. During all this, Khrushchev had held no office in the Soviet government, but had functioned only as party leader. But what he did in that capacity was of vital significance. Systematically, he replaced party functionaries on all levels, moving upwards those who he could depend on and eliminating those he could not trust to support him personally. The other rival leaders in the government knew what was going on, but ignored it, since they made the one basic error which could not be remedied. They believed that the government was the ruling structure in the Soviet Union, while Khrushchev, quietly at his work within the party structure, looked forward to the day on which he would demonstrate their error. In February 1956, in what is unquestionably one of the most significant events in the history of communism, Khrushchev lighted one of his sticks of dynamite. The subsequent explosion is still echoing, and the resulting wound to international communism still bleeds freely. Khrushchev's preparation for a party congress was as careful as Stalin had ever been. It was to be a sounding board for coordinating party policy by speeches to his hand-picked subordinates. In July 1955, the Congress was called for February 14, 1956. At the same time, two Khrushchev agents were added to the Presidium, Mikhail Suslov and Igor Kirichenko, and 3 Khrushchev agents were added to the party secretariat. Averky, Aristov, Ivan Belyaev, and Dmitry Shapilov. The last, who was editor of Pravda, the party newspaper, gave the speech on foreign policy at the Congress, although Molotov was still foreign minister and was not replaced by Shapilov until August. Aristov soon took over the role of Post-Kribyshev had previously played for Stalin, in charge of loyalty purges within the party. The 20th Party Congress met for 11 days, February 14th through the 25th, 1956, within the Kremlin walls. Its 1,436 hand-picked delegates formed the oldest Congress which had ever assembled, with 24% over 50 years of age, compared to 15.3% over 50 at the 19th Congress and only 1.8% over 50 at the 18th Congress of February 1941. These men were fully prepared to support whatever was told them, but none could have anticipated the shocking revelations they would hear. It all began in a rather routine fashion. The first speech of 50,000 words delivered by Khrushchev over 7 hours, 1 hour less than Malenkov's parallel speech in October 1952, was full of factual details. It was notable only for its frequent reference to the urgent need for coexistence with the West and its infrequent use of the name Stalin. The emphasis on coexistence was part of the campaign against Molotov and, as is usual in communist speeches, was filled with references by volume and page to the writings of Lenin. Most of these references proved, on examination, to be embedded in a context expounding the inevitable clash between communism and capitalism. The delegates, fully trained in such dialectic, had no difficulty in seeing the point. Coexistence was merely a temporary tactic in a larger framework of inevitable struggle. Similar references were made to the possibility of peaceful, rather than revolutionary, change from capitalism to socialism in single countries. In this case, examples were given: the Baltic states, the East European satellites, and China. The reference to Lenin, volume 33, pages 57 to 58, made perfectly clear that the peaceful road to socialism could be followed only where a small capitalist state was overrun by a powerful communist neighbor. The chief surprise of the general sessions of the Party Congress was the speech from that old party chameleon, Anatas Mikoyan. It openly criticized Stalin for his disregard of party democracy and his cult of personality, which insisted on personal adulation and on the constant rewriting of party records and Russian history, so that Stalin would always appear as the infallible and clairvoyant leader. The real explosion came at a secret all-night session on July 24th to 25th, from which all foreign delegates were excluded. Those who listened were warned to take no notes or records. In a speech of 30,000 words, Khrushchev made a horrifying attack on Stalin as a bloodthirsty and demented tyrant who had destroyed tens of thousands of loyal party members on falsified evidence or no evidence at all, merely to satisfy his own insatiable thirst for power. All the charges, which had been made by anti-communist and anti-Stalinist in the 1930s, were repeated and driven home with specific details, dates, and names. The full nightmare of the Soviet system was revealed, not as an attribute of the system, which it was, but as a personal idiosyncrasy of Stalin himself, not as the chief feature of communism from 1917, which it was, but only as its chief feature since 1934, and nothing was said of the full collaboration in the process of terror provided to Stalin by the surviving members of the Politburo led by Khrushchev himself. But all the rest, which the fellow travelers throughout the world had been denying for a generation, poured out. The enormous slave labor camps, the murder of innocent persons by tens of thousands, the wholesale violation of law, the use of fiendishly planned torture to extract confessions for acts never done or to involve persons who were completely innocent, the ruthless elimination of whole classes and of whole nations, such as army officers, the kulaks, and the Kalmuk, Chechen, Ingush, and Balkar minority groups. The servility of writers, artists, and everyone else, including all party members, to the tyrant was revealed, along with the total failure of his agricultural schemes, his cowardice and incompetence in the war, his insignificance in the early history of the party, and his constant rewriting of history to conceal these things. A few passages from this speech will indicate its tone. Stalin's negative characteristics which in Lenin's time were only beginning, changed in his last years in a grave abuse of power which caused untold harm to the party. Stalin acted not through persuasion, explanation, and patient cooperation with people, but by imposing his ideas and by demanding complete submission to his opinion. Whoever opposed this or tried to argue his own point of view was doomed to be purged and to subsequent moral and physical annihilation. Stalin originated the concept enemy of the people, a term which made it unnecessary to prove the ideological errors of the victim. It made it possible to use the cruelest representation and utmost illegality against anyone who disagreed in any way with Stalin, against those who were only suspected or had been subject of rumors. This concept of enemy of the people eliminated any possibility of ideological fight or rebuttal. Usually, the only evidence used against all the rules of modern legal science was the confession of the accused, and as subsequent investigation showed, such confessions were obtained by physical pressure on the accused. The formula enemy of the people was specifically introduced for the purpose of physically annihilating these persons. He abandoned the methods of ideological struggle for administrative violence, mass repression, and terror. Lenin used such methods only against actual class enemies and not against those who blunder or err, or whom it is possible to lead through theory and even retain as leaders. Stalin so elevated himself above the party and above the state that he ceased to consider either the Central Committee or the party. The number of arrests based on charges of counter-revolutionary crimes increased tenfold from 1936 to 1937. When the cases of some of these so-called spies and saboteurs were examined, it was found that all their cases were fabricated. Confessions of guilt of many were gained by cruel and inhumane tortures. Comrade Rudzutak, candidate member of the Politburo, party member from 1905, who spent 10 years in a czarist hard labor camp, completely retracted in court the confession which had been forced from him. This retraction was ignored in spite of the fact that Rudzutak had been chief of the party Central Control Commission established by Lenin to ensure party unity. He was not even called before the Central Committee's Politburo because Stalin refused to talk to him. Sentence was pronounced in a trial of 20 minutes, and he was shot. After careful re-examination of the case in 1955, it was established that the accusation against Rudzutak was false and based on falsified evidence. The way in which the NKVD manufactured fictitious anti-Soviet centers and blocks can be seen in the case of Comrade Rosenblum, party member from 1906, who was arrested in 1937 by the Leningrad NKVD. He was subjected to terrible torture, during which he was ordered to confess false information about himself and other persons. He was then brought to the office of Zakhovsky, who offered him freedom on the condition that he make before the court a false confession fabricated in 1937 by the NKVD concerning sabotage, espionage, and subversion in a terroristic center in Leningrad. With unbelievable cynicism, Zakhovsky told about the method for the creation of fabricated anti-Soviet plots. You yourself, said Zakhovsky, will not need to invent anything. The NKVD will prepare for you an outline for every branch of the center. You will have to study it carefully and to remember well all questions and answers which the court may ask. Your future will depend on how the trial goes and on its results. If you manage to endure it, you will save your head, and we will feed you and clothe you at the government's expense until your death. The NKVD prepared lists of persons whose cases were before the military tribunal and whose sentences were prepared in advance. Yezhov would send these lists to Stalin personally for his approval of the punishments. In 1937 to 1938, such lists of many thousands of party, government, communist, youth, army, and economic workers were sent to Stalin. He approved those lists. Stalin was a very distrustful man, morbidly suspicious. We knew this from our work with him. He would look at a man and say, "Why are your eyes so shifty today?" Or, "Why are you turning so much today, and why do you avoid looking at me directly?" This sickly suspicion created in him distrust of eminent party workers he had known for years. Everywhere and in everything he saw enemies, two-facers, and spies. How is it possible that a person confesses to crimes which he has not committed? Only in one way, by application of physical pressure, tortures, bringing him to a state of unconsciousness, deprivation of his judgment, taking away of his human dignity. In this way were confessions obtained. Only a few days before the present Congress, we called to the Central Committee Presidium and interrogated the investigative judge Rodos, who in his time investigated and interrogated Kosyer, Chubar, and Kosarev. Kosaryev. He is a vile person with the brain of a bird and morally completely degenerate. And it was this man who was deciding the fate of prominent party workers. He told us, "I know that Kosyer and Chubar were the people's enemies, and for that reason I, as investigative judge, had to make them confess that they are enemies. I thought that I was executing the orders of the party." The secret speech also destroyed Stalin's reputation as a military genius. During the war and afterward, Stalin said that the tragedy experienced by the nation in the early days of the war resulted from the unexpected attack by the Germans. But, comrades, this is completely untrue. By April 3, 1941, Churchill, through his ambassador to the USSR, Cripps, personally warned Stalin that the Germans were regrouping their armed units to attack the Soviet Union. Churchill stressed this repeatedly in his dispatches of April 18th and in the following days. Stalin took no heed of these warnings. Moreover, he warned that no credence be given to information of this sort in order not to provoke the beginning of military operations. Information of this kind on German invasions of Soviet territory was coming in from our own military and diplomatic sources. Despite these particularly grave warnings, the necessary steps were not taken to prepare the country properly for defense and to prevent it from being caught unawares. Did we have time and resources for such preparation? Yes, we did. Our industry was fully capable of supplying everything the Soviet army needed. Had our industry been mobilized properly and in time to supply the army, our wartime losses would have been decidedly smaller. On the eve of the invasion, a German citizen crossed our border and stated that the German armies had orders to start their offensive on the night of June 22nd at 3 a.m. Stalin was informed of this immediately, but even this was ignored. As you see, everything was ignored. The result was that, in the first hours and days, the enemy destroyed in our border regions a large part of our air force, artillery, and other equipment. He annihilated large numbers of our soldiers and disorganized our military leadership. Consequently, we could not prevent the enemy from marching deep into the country. Very grievous consequences, especially at the beginning of the war, followed Stalin's destruction of many military commanders and political workers during 1937 to 1941 because of his suspiciousness and false accusations. During that time, the leaders who gained military experience in Spain and in the Far East were almost completely liquidated. After the first severe disaster and defeats at the front, Stalin thought that this was the end. He said, "All that which Lenin created, we have lost forever." After this, Stalin for a long time actually did not direct the military operations and ceased to do anything whatever. Therefore, the danger which hung over our fatherland in the first period of the war was largely due to the faulty methods of directing the nation and the party by Stalin himself. Later, the nervousness and hysteria which Stalin showed, interfering with actual military operations, caused our army serious damage. He was very far from any understanding of the real solution which was developing on the front. This was natural, for in the whole war, he never visited any section of the front or any liberated city. When a very serious situation developed for our army in the Kharkov region in 1942, we decided to give up an operation seeking to encircle Kharkov to avoid fatal consequences if the operation continued. Contrary to sense, Stalin rejected our suggestion and issued orders to continue the operation. I telephoned to Stalin at his villa, but he refused to answer the phone, and Malenkov was on the receiver. I stated for a second time that I wanted to speak to Stalin personally about the grave situation at the front, but Stalin did not consider it convenient to raise the phone and insisted that I speak to him through Malenkov, although he was only a few steps away. After listening in this fashion to our plea, Stalin said, "Let everything remain as it is." What was the result of this? The worst that we had expected. The Germans surrounded our army concentrations, and we lost hundreds of thousands of our soldiers. This is Stalin's military genius and what it cost us. After this party congress, we shall have to reevaluate our military operations and present them in their true light. After our great victory, which cost us so much, Stalin began to belittle many of the commanders who contributed to the victory because Stalin excluded every possibility that victories at the front should be credited to anyone but himself. He began to tell all kinds of nonsense about Zhukov. He popularized himself as a great leader and tried to inculcate in the people the idea that all victories won in the war were due to the courage, daring, and genius of Stalin and no one else. Let us take, for instance, our historical and military films and some written works. They make us feel sick. Their real purpose is propagation of the theme of Stalin as a military genius. Remember the film The Fall of Berlin. Here, only Stalin acts. He issues orders in a hall in which there are many empty chairs, and only one man approaches him and reports to him. That is, Paskhribishev, his loyal shield bearer. Where is the military command? Where is the Politburo? Where is the government? What are they doing? There is nothing about them in the film. Stalin acts for everybody. He pays no attention to them. He asks no one for advice. Where are the military who bear the burden of the war? They are not in the film. With Stalin in, there is no room for them. You see to what Stalin's delusions of grandeur led. He had completely lost consciousness of reality. One characteristic example of Stalin's self-glorification and of his lack of elementary modesty was his short biography published in 1948. It is an expression of most dissolute flattery, making him into a man, making a man into a god, transforming him into an infallible sage, the greatest leader and most sublime strategist of all times and nations. No other words could be found to raise Stalin to the heavens. We need not give examples of the loathsome adulation filling this book. They were all approved and edited by Stalin personally, and some of them were added in his own handwriting to the draft of the book. He added, although he performed his task of leader of the party and the people with consummate skill and enjoyed the unreserved support of the whole Soviet people, Stalin never allowed his work to be marred by the slightest hint of vanity, conceit, or self-adulation. I'll cite one more insertion made by Stalin. The advanced Soviet science of war received further deployment at Comrade Stalin's hands. He elaborated the theory of the permanently operating factors that decided the issues of wars. Comrade Stalin's genius enabled him to divine the enemy's plans and defeat them. The battles in which Comrade Stalin directed the Soviet armies are brilliant examples of operational military skill. All those who interested themselves even a little bit in the national situation saw the difficult situation in agriculture, but Stalin never even noticed it. Did we tell Stalin about this? Yes, we told him, but he did not support us. Why? Because Stalin never traveled anywhere, did not meet city or farm workers. He did not know the actual situation in the provinces. He knew the country and agriculture from He knew the country and agriculture only from films, and these films had dressed up and beautified the existing situation in agriculture. They so pictured collective farm life that the tables were bending from the weight of turkeys and geese. Stalin thought it was actually so. Stalin proposed that the taxes paid by the collective farms and by their workers should be raised by 40 billion rubles. According to him, the peasants are well off, and the collective farm worker would need to sell only one more chicken to pay his tax in full. Imagine what this meant. Certainly, 40 billion rubles is a sum greater than everything the collective farmers obtained for all the products they sold to the state. In 1952, for instance, the collective farms and their workers received 26,280 million rubles for all their products sold to the government. The proposal was not based on an actual assessment of the situation, but on the fantastic ideas of a person divorced from reality. It was inconceivable that this extraordinary speech could be kept a secret in spite of all the warnings at its delivery that it must be. Versions of it, some of them softened, were sent out by the Kremlin to foreign party leaders. One of these found its way to the United States government and was published on June 2, 1956. There is not the slightest doubt that the speech is authentic and that almost everything it says is true. But the mystery remains. Why did the Kremlin leaders decide to speak thus of a situation which every student of the subject knew, at least partially, but which could still be denied so long as it was not admitted? One factor in the making of the speech was undoubtedly the determination of the army to clear itself of the unjust accusation made against its officers in 1937 to 1941 and against the effort to attribute the disasters of 1941 to 1942 to professional incompetence. Just as the German generals after 1945 wanted to blame their defeats on Hitler, so the Russian generals, with much greater justification, wanted to blame their early defeats on Stalin. But there undoubtedly must have been other causes of which we are not yet aware. The anti-Stalin speech, like the admission of error in the alienation from Tito, inevitably had an injurious influence on communism throughout the world, especially in the satellite powers, and ultimately became the ideological basis for the splitting of these powers into Stalinist and anti-Stalinist groupings led by Red China and the Soviet Union. Certain points about this speech are noteworthy. In the first place, all the criticism of Stalin is directed at his actions subsequent to 1934. These are criticized not because they were vile in themselves, but because they were injurious to the party and to loyal party members. Throughout this speech, As in everything else he did in this period, Khrushchev was working to strengthen the party. Moreover, by directing his criticism at Stalin personally, he exculpated he exculpated himself and the other Bolsheviks survivors who were fully as guilty as Stalin was, guilty not merely because they acquiesced in Stalin's atrocities from fear, as Khrushchev admitted in the speech, but because they fully cooperated with him. A study of Khrushchev's own life shows that he supported Stalin's atrocities fully at the time, often anticipated them, benefited personally from them, and egged Stalin on to greater ones. In fact, even as Khrushchev in his speech condemned Stalin's acts which caused the deaths of thousands in the parties, he defended Stalin's acts which caused the deaths of millions in the country. The fault was not merely with Stalin, it was with the system, and even wider than that, it was with Russia. Any system of human life which is based on autocracy and authority, as Russian life had always been, will turn up sadistic monsters as Russia has throughout its history again and again. And the more completely total and irresponsible power is concentrated in one man's hands, the more frequently will a monster of sadism be produced. The very structure of Russian life on the authoritarian lines it had always possessed drove Khrushchev, as it had driven Stalin 30 years before, to concentrate all power in his own hands. Neither man could relax halfway to power for fear that someone else would continue on seeking the peak of power. The basis of the whole system was fear, and like all neurotic drives in a neurotic system, such fear cannot be overcome even by achievement of total power. That is why it grows into paranoia, as it did with Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Paul I, Stalin, and others. During all the struggle for power within the Kremlin, foreign affairs were still actively pursued by the Soviet leaders. The chief event was a change in direction from Europe to Asia, which took place in the spring of 1955. The Austrian Treaty, the reconciliation with Tito, the stalemate over the German problem, the Warsaw Pact, and the Geneva Spirit were all parts of the plan to put Europe on ice in order to shift attention to Southeast Asia, to India, and to the Near East. This new direction was opened by beginning arms shipments to Colonel Gamal Nasser of Egypt in the spring of 1955 and reached its peak in the so-called Suez Crisis of October 1956. A similar effort in India, seeking to win its support for the Soviet bloc, began with the state visit to India and Burma by Bulganin and Khrushchev in November 1955. This new direction and its consequences will be described in a moment, but it must be recognized that the continuing struggle for control within the Kremlin and the satellite states ran parallel with the growing crisis in the Near East, and that both reached the critical stage at the same time in October 1956. The struggle between the Stalinist and the anti-Stalinist within the satellite states and the discontent of the inhabitants with both groups kept public affairs agitated along the whole zone of satellite areas from the Baltic to the Balkans. Khrushchev's secret speech increased this agitation. Pressure on Khrushchev inside the Kremlin to reverse his professed policy of de-Stalinization grew. Khrushchev struck back. On June 2, 1956, the same day that Tito arrived for a state visit to Moscow, Molotov was removed as foreign minister and replaced by Khrushchev's agent Shipilov, the editor of Pravda. But the satellite turmoil continued. This turmoil, which agitated Eastern Europe for many years, may be regarded as a series of clashes between Stalinism and Titoism. Neither of these as an extreme pole of dualistic opposition, but rather two positions on a number of scales, concerned rather with methods than with goals. Both have as a goal the creation of powerful and prosperous communist systems, but they do not agree on methods, or rather on the relative mixture of methods to be used to reach their goal. Each sees industrialization as necessary to such a goal, but Tito is, perhaps necessarily, more willing to use foreign investment and foreign technical guidance if these are free from any political control. Stalinism in general distrusts all foreign help as spying, relying on domestic capital accumulation and determined to raise it speedily. Stalin puts severe pressures on the peasantry and thus emphasizes collective farms under political pressure, while Titoism is prepared to make much more use of private agriculture and of economic incentives for food production. This entails a slower rate of industrialization and more emphasis on improved standards of living. There are also other, more pervasive differences. Stalinism insists on uniformity and centralized authority, while Titoism is more willing to allow diversity and collegial control. This, in their terms, is the distinction between a monolithic bloc and collective leadership. When the monolithic bloc is subject to criticism, it is called the cult of personality. In the satellites, for historical reasons, there are other sharp distinctions between Stalinism and Titoism. The former favors Russian domination, while the latter favors local nationalism. As a consequence, in 1945 to 1960, the former favored those local leaders who had spent the pre-war and war periods in exile in the Soviet Union, while the latter favored the underground fighters who stayed at home in the left-wing resistance groups. And finally, the Stalinists upheld their road to socialism as the only road, while the Titoists contended that there were many roads to socialism. As might be expected, political oppression and the rule of the monolithic party was associated with the one point of view, while a greater readiness to allow diversity of outlook and coalition regimes marked the other. There is no doubt that Stalin intended to establish a fully Stalinist system just as described in Eastern Europe, the zone, as Seton Watson calls it. But this cannot be done immediately in the chaos of war's ending. Accordingly, a period of real coalition regimes was established based on the association of all groups and parties which had resisted Nazism. Most of these groups were made up of peasants, workers, and intellectuals led by a combination of exiles back from Russia and hardened resistance fighters. One of the chief acts of these coalition regimes in most countries was agrarian reform, that is, the division of former large estates into the hands of peasant owners. Within a few years, and in most cases by 1948, this coalition was broken down and replaced by narrow Stalinist control governed by a typical Stalinist tyranny. This was achieved by getting the significant government post into the hands of hardcore Stalinists, usually the former Moscow exiles, and forcing other groups out of the coalition. In this process, the presence of Soviet troops was often the vital factor. Along with this went a social, economic, and propagandist campaign to split the farmers by calling the more affluent, better educated, or more obstinate ones agrarian reactionaries and enemies of the people. These were liquidated frequently by death. The chief index showing that this stage had been reached was usually a reversal of agricultural policy from agrarian reform to collectivization, similar to that achieved in Russia in 1930 to 1934. As one consequence of this change, each satellite found its welfare, especially in economics, subordinated to that of the Soviet Union. This was reflected in numerous economic and commercial agreements which set up conditions of commercial exchange and joint owned public corporations able to milk the satellite countries for Russia's benefit. Some of this was based on reparations. As examples of this exploitation, we might mention that the joint corporations in East Germany drained from that area goods worth a billion Reichmarks a year in terms of 1936 prices in the 1946 to 1948 period. The Soviet-Polish Coal Agreement of 1945 bound Poland to sell coal to Russia at one-tenth the price obtainable elsewhere. In all, it has been estimated that the Soviet Union extracted goods worth $20 billion out of Eastern Europe in 1945 to 1946. By 1952, Eastern Europe, with the notable exception of Yugoslavia, was being organized as a colony of the Soviet Union along Stalinist lines. The bitter attacks on Tito arose from Tito's refusal to accept this and from the challenge which the existence of his different system offered to Stalin's control. Tito was able to resist because he was outside the zone of Soviet military occupation and had built up a military and bureaucratic hierarchy loyal to him, while inside that zone, these hierarchies had been constructed under Soviet guidance and were loyal to Stalin rather than to the local leaders. One exception, Albania, sided with Stalin because it feared Yugoslavia just as Tito feared the Soviet Union as too powerful a neighbor. In 1951 to 1952, the incipient purge in the Soviet Union was extended to the satellites, where its anti-Semitic overtones were even more evident. Rudolf Slansky, leader of the Czech Communist Party, was tried and executed in spite of his abject subservience to Stalin, while Anna Pauker was removed from her office in Romania. This drove Tito closer to the Western camp and led Tito's friend Milovan Dijas to recognize that the problem of Stalinism was not personal but institutional, caused by the structure of the system, a disease fatal to any real social welfare. He called this disease bureaucratic degeneration. When Dijas went further at the end of 1953 and recognized that the real issue was between freedom and absolutism, a choice for all the zone between the West and the East, he broke with Tito because his criticisms clearly applied to Tito's authoritarian bureaucracy as well. Many persons in the satellites, even the young who had lifelong indoctrination in the authoritarian outlook, reached similar conclusions and were like tinder to any anti-Soviet spark. The sparks were provided by Khrushchev, with his continued curtailment of secret police, his acceptance of Titoism, and above all his secret speech. Few recognized that Khrushchev was basically an ultra-Stalinist himself, fully committed to foreign aggression and to ultra-industrialization and to ruthless discipline of the working masses, especially the peasants. His tactical shifts were taken as indicators of moderate personality, while, in fact, Khrushchev was as extreme as Stalin and more reckless. As part of the thaw in Eastern Europe, there was a considerable shift from Stalinism. Hundreds of thousands of political prisoners were either released or given reduced sentences, and party leaders who had been purged were restored to the party. Some who had been executed were posthumously rehabilitated. The key indicator, pressure to build up collective farms, was reversed in Hungary in a single year, May 1953 to May 1954. The acreage under collective farming decreased one-third, while the number of peasants on such farms fell 45%. This was fairly typical of the zone as a whole. The general shift undoubtedly encouraged resistance to Soviet domination, a feeling which was greatly increased in 1956 by three other factors. 1. The growing impoverishment of the zone from Soviet exploitation, from the poor crops and food shortages of 1956, and from the equally grave fuel shortages, both coal and petroleum. 2. The shift of Soviet attention from Europe to Asia. 3. The unexpected reaction to the secret speech. The consequences of these disturbing influences were general in the zone, but specific cases of Poland and Hungary hold great interest because they worked in such totally different ways. The chief difference, of course, was the great strength of the Polish leaders and people, going back to their terrible experiences at the hands of both Russians and Germans and their memories of extraordinary feats of the underground resistance. Soviet reactions to Polish demands for liberalizing the regime were undoubtedly influenced by a reluctance to meet that resistance again. However, the chief difference lay in the related facts that the leaders of the Polish Communist Party led the demand for liberalization and maintained a united front while doing so, while the Hungary movement was resisted by the party leaders and could be split by personal ambitions. The crisis began in both countries in the week of June 1956. A stoppage of work at the Polish railway factory in Poznan grew into a mass demonstration against the communist regime. Shots were fired, and eventually over 50 were killed and 323 arrested. Polish Party Secretary Ochab made concessions to the opposition and attributed the episode to social roots, the existence of serious disturbances between the party and the various sections of the working classes. This was rejected 3 days later by Bulganin during a sudden and unexpected visit of the Kremlin's leaders to Warsaw. Their version attributed the troubles to foreign capitalist agitators. They do that a lot. Ochab continued his concessions and, on August 4th, readmitted to the party the popular Vladislav Gomulka, Vladislav Gomulka, a strong nationalist communist who had been removed and imprisoned at Stalin's orders in 1951. Because the continued worsening of economic conditions in the late summer of 1956 made it impossible for the Polish communists to offer the people any substantial economic concessions, they continued the political relaxation which alarmed the Kremlin. The trials of those arrested in June disturbances were fair and punishments lenient amid growing nationalist enthusiasm. On October 15th, Moscow learned of a Polish decision to convene the Polish Central Committee on October 18th to elect a new Politburo, which would not include Soviet Marshal K.K. Rokossovsky, defense minister of Poland since the days of Stalin, and would make Gomulka party secretary. After a hurried meeting of the Soviet Presidium on October 18th, Soviet troops and naval contingents began to converge on Poland, and Khrushchev, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Mikoyan burst into the Polish Central Committee session of October 19th just as it began. The presence of that rigid Stalinist Molotov, who had been dismissed as Foreign Secretary in June, was significant of the precarious deadline of Khrushchev's position in the Kremlin. Khrushchev, however, acted as a Soviet spokesman at the session in Belvedere Palace. He was violent and bellicose, calling Gomulka a traitor and threatening dire consequences if the old Politburo, including Rokossovsky, was not reinstated. Ochab, still Polish secretary, was firm and ordered the immediate halt of Soviet troop advances, or all negotiations would be ended and the Poles would take the consequences. This meant resistance to the Russians by the tough, well-armed Polish security corps. Khrushchev stopped his troop movements, the Russians withdrew, and the sessions of the Polish Central Committee finished its work, electing a new non-Soviet Politburo which excluded Rakov's, Rakov's, I don't know, Rokossovsky, made Khrushchev made Gomulka secretary. The latter, in the course of the discussions with Khrushchev, had indicated that his liberalization would extend only to domestic affairs and would not injure Polish-Soviet friendship or the Warsaw Pact. In his speech to the committee, Gomulka sought to reconcile nationalist communism with Polish-Soviet friendship and made a severe attack on the cult of personality with its hideous atrocities under the Stalinist regime. Rokossovsky resigned as defense minister and returned to Russia with more than 30 other Soviet high military officers in November. Khrushchev publicly yielded in the Polish crisis on October 23rd when he issued a statement that he saw no obstacles in retaliation between the two countries from the committee's actions and that the Soviet troops would be withdrawn to their bases. On the same day, he was taking steps to crush the parallel crisis in Hungary. The troubles in the Magyar state in the summer of 1956 took the same forms as in Poland, but instead of being directed by the Communist Party secretary, they were directed against him. They appeared as agitations against the indefatigable Stalinist Mateusz Rakowski, and in favor of the mild Emir Nagy, who had been premier in 1953 to 1955 as Malenkov's choice and had been removed at Khrushchev's orders. On July 18th, Khrushchev tried to deflate these agitations by ordering some minor reforms and replacing Rakowski as party secretary by his deputy, the uncouth and obstinate Stalinist Erno Gero. This simply intensified the agitations, which rose to a crescendo in September, chiefly from the meetings and resolutions of students, workers, and literary groups. Some of their demands were successful, including on October 19th, abolition of the compulsory study of the Russian language. On October 22nd, a meeting of about 4,000 students discussing changes in university life became diverted to political agitations and drew up 16 points which they tried to force Radio Budapest to broadcast. Omissions of some of the points, demanding a new economic policy, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, free elections, freedom of the press, and reform of the Communist Party, led to a mass demonstration on October 23rd. When Gero refused their demands, the students began to riot, smashing to pieces the huge statue of Stalin in the center of the city. The security police killed several demonstrators, but when the regular Hungarian troops were called to restore order, they joined the agitators. By that time, Soviet troops began to move from 50 miles away and arrived in the city by 2 a.m. on October 24th. Mikoyan had preceded them. It soon became clear that the Soviet tanks could not control the situation because they could be blocked by overturned streetcars or other obstacles and could not subdue rioters in strong buildings. Mikoyan dismissed Gero and put in, as party secretary, Janos Kedar, until then a known opponent of the Stalinist group. By that time, October 24th, the revolt had spread through Hungary under the passive eyes of the Soviet troops. On the following day, Nagy, still in touch with Mikoyan, formed a new government and negotiated a ceasefire. The Russian forces withdrew from Budapest, and negotiations were opened between their officers and the Nagy government for their withdrawal from the country. By that time, the whole communist system in Hungary had collapsed. Unofficial elected groups had seized power throughout the country, the secret police and the party had disintegrated, a revolutionary council had taken control of the Hungarian army, and Colonel Pál Maleter, a leader of the revolt, had been made a major general and minister of defense. Most significant of all, the one-party system had been ended, and members of the revived non-communist parties had joined the cabinet. On October 31st, the official Soviet news agency, TASS, announced that the Kremlin was ready to recognize the new government and negotiate withdrawal of all Soviet troops from the country. However, as October ended, large Soviet forces began to invade Hungary, crossing into the country on numerous temporary combat bridges. On November 1st, Kedar, who had pretended to be one of Nagy's closest supporters, fled from Budapest to the Soviet headquarters at Sloz, Solnak, or Zolnak. There he set up a new government under Soviet control. The same day, Nagy called to the United Nations, appealing for help and announcing Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and its resumption of neutrality. In the meantime, the Soviet invasion was in full operation, overrunning the country and smashing into Budapest before dawn on November 4th. Most of the resistance was overwhelmed that day. As it collapsed, the Nagy government and their families took refuge in Yugoslav embassy. The Yugoslavs, including Tito, were obviously confused by Kedar's change of sides and accepted his promise of safe conduct to their homes for Nagy and associates. However, when these people left the security of the embassy on November 22nd, they were seized by Soviet forces and deported to prisons outside Hungary. By that date, the flight of refugees from Hungary was in flood, despite efforts by the Kedar government to prevent it. Many were killed as they tried to pass the frontiers, but thousands escaped to the west, where many of them were able to continue their studies in a new way of life. The costs of the uprising were catastrophic. On the Hungarian side, there were about 2,800 killed, 13,000 wounded, and 4,000 buildings destroyed, but tens of thousands were in exile or in hiding. The country was shattered and lay, as a conquered country, under the armed forces of its oppressor. The unanticipated consequence of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization efforts in Eastern Europe were bound to injure Khrushchev in the Kremlin power struggle. Indeed, they brought him to the brink of final disaster early in 1957. As usual, the shifts of power were indicated by changes in personnel. Kaganovich, who had been removed from the government on June 5, 1956, was restored as Minister of Building Materials on September 22nd. Shepilov, who had been Khrushchev's appointee as foreign minister in June, lost his other post as secretary to the Central Committee on Christmas Day, 1956. Above all, on November 22nd, Molotov was made Minister of State Control, a post which had budgetary functions in all parts of the state-controlled economy and could have been built up into state power in opposition to Khrushchev's party power in the economic system. Moreover, de-Stalinization ceased after July 1956, and even Khrushchev found it necessary to praise the old ogre. On December 23rd, Pravda denied that there had ever been any Stalinism in Soviet Union. 8 days later, Khrushchev said, "We can state with contrition that we are all Stalinist in fact." On January 17, 1957, at the Chinese embassy in Moscow, he said, "Stalinism, like Stalin himself, is inseparable from communism." In the fight against the enemies of our class, Stalin defended the cause of Marxism-Leninism. For Khrushchev, as for all the Soviet leaders, the great issue was to prevent Titoism from spreading into the Soviet Union and, if possible, to curtail its spread amongst the satellites. Every effort was made to prevent knowledge of the Polish October and the Hungarian Revolt from reaching the Soviet people, and the attacks on Tito and Yugoslavia were resumed. Tito struck back on November 11th with the charge that Stalin had taken the domestic and foreign policies of the Soviet Union to dead ends, and that his errors were not personal ones but intrinsic in the Soviet system of monolithic authoritarianism. He was refuted in Pravda a week later. The Hungarian invasion destroyed much of the appeal of communism to the leftists of Western Europe and the world. This had already been left in shreds by the secret speech. Even in the Soviet Union, university students and intellectuals disapproved of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Many literary works written during the de-Stalinization phase in the spring were published the following winter, when the tide had turned again. Khrushchev struck hard at these groups and continued to do so for several years, with the result that the alienation of Russian intellectuals from Khrushchev became established. This was reflected in the expulsion from the universities later in 1956 of hundreds of students who refused to applaud the Soviet attack on Hungary. The official Soviet line was that most disturbances of this kind arose from the activities of foreign agitators of capitalist aggressors. Simultaneously with the Soviet political and intellectual reactions after June 1956 came a series of efforts to alienate the economic stringency. Wages were raised, taxes reduced on the poorest payers, social benefits were extended, and the labor unions were urged to protect them. Numerous projects in heavy industry under the 5-year plan were slowed up and their resources diverted to consumer goods. Most significant of all, there was a sharp increase in the influence of state officials and corresponding decrease in that of party officials. This reversal was fully evident in the Central Committee session of late December 1956, but the following meeting in February 1957 showed Khrushchev in an aggressive counterattack. This took the form of suggestions for drastic reorganization of Soviet economic life towards a more decentralized system. Undoubtedly, this plan had considerable merit, but in Khrushchev's eyes, it had an additional advantage, since it would remove much of the economic life from the influence of central state ministries and leave it open to increased influence from political groups. He proposed the division of the Soviet Union into several dozen economic regions, each under an economic council or Sovnarkozy of diverse groups, and the devolution of these groups of the economic functions of the majority of the economic ministries in Moscow. These ministries would be abolished along with the State Commission for Current Planning, GEK, and Molotov's Ministry of State Control. This would leave only the Long Range Economic Planning Agency, Gosplan, and a few economic ministries at the center, with annual planning and most execution left to the regional or lower groupings. All right, I'm going to stop reading right there. Unless there's like the chapter's really about to be over. No. All right. So this chapter is really just more about the intrigue of Khrushchev and basically how he was trying to take over the Soviet party and make it into like one monolithic party where basically he was at the head of the whole thing. But it didn't really work because once he did the quote unquote secret speech where he revealed that, basically all the intrigue that was going on in the party, even though he tried to deny that he was involved in it, intellectuals in the satellite countries read that stuff after it was published by the United States, and then they started doing their own revolts. Even though they were still communist for the most part, they wanted to not be like directly under Khrushchev. And then when that happened, he had to basically back out of this whatever he said in the secret speech and pretend like he was totally on Stalin's jock the whole time. And I think that's where we're up to right now. Link in the description if you want to read ahead more, if you just can't contain yourself. Otherwise, I'm just going to get out of here. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you're not going to hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.